As introduction to my AMLASH video, I should explain that I think there was a Castro plot to assassinate John Kennedy, and that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with this plot, and that the CIA knew about this plot, and that they used the plot to make sure that it succeeded in killing JFK, and then they executed Oswald after it was over. And so, also in introduction, it should be noted that at the end of after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy administration ceased assassination attempts on Castro. That is, the authorization for them from the top of the government, according to the information as I understand it, stopped. So in this period after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the fall of 1962, through the time of the assassination, as I understand it, it was the official policy of the Kennedy administration not to assassinate Castro. But, however, we have the AMLASH program, which I'm going to discuss here. Now, AMLASH is a CIA code name that refers to Rolando Kubela, and I'll probably just keep calling him AMLASH. This is from Spartacus here, a little thing on this incident. And Rolando Kubela was born in Cuba. He trained as a doctor, but as a student he became very involved in politics. A strong opponent of Fulgencio Batista, Kubela joined the Directo Revolucionario. In 1956, he assassinated Antonio Blanchi Rico, the head of Batista's security forces. Kubela joined the revolution led by Fidel Castro and was involved in capturing the presidential palace in Havana. At first, Kubela and the Directo Revolucionario refused to surrender the building to Che Guevara, but eventually it was turned over to the new revolutionary government. Kubela was given the highest rank in the Cuban army. Later he became an official in Castro's government and was leader of Cuba's International Federation of Students. In March 1961, Kubela approached the Central Intelligence Agency about defecting to the United States. He was persuaded to work for them as an undercover agent in Cuba. He was given the code name AMLASH and reported to JM Wave. However, Joseph Langosh of the Special Affairs Staff suspected that Kubela was a dangle, a double agent recruited by Castro to penetrate the American plots against him. This idea was reinforced when Kubela refused to take a lie detector test. In September 1963, Kubela had a meeting with the CIA in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It was suggested that Kubela should assassinate Fidel Castro. According to a CIA report, Kubela asked for a meeting with Robert Kennedy for assurances of U.S. moral support for any activity Kubela undertook in Cuba. So in this Spartacus summary of Kubela, it says that in September 1963 it was suggested that Kubela should assassinate Fidel Castro. It is denied by the CIA personnel that the CIA considered this to be an assassination plot, but that rather they considered it to be a plot to encourage an insurrection in Cuba. And the reason they're denying it, probably, is because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy administration stopped Operation Mongoose, and apparently it became an understanding that the United States would not seek to assassinate Castro. And but this is the way that Spartacus presents it. Just reading this, you might think the CIA suggested that he should assassinate Castro. The documents, however, kind of sort of support the CIA on this. Also, the idea is talked about here that Kubela might have been a double agent, a Castro dangle. I didn't finish reading that. Let me finish reading that part. Starting again, in September 1963, Kubela had a meeting with CIA in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It was suggested that Kubela should assassinate Fidel Castro. According to a CIA report, Kubela asked for a meeting with Robert Kennedy. for assurances of U.S. moral support for any activity Kubela undertook in Cuba. This was not possible. Chief of the Cuban task force agreed to meet Kubela. Ted Shackley was opposed to the idea, as he was now convinced that Kubela was a double agent. And this is something that I think is true. I think Kubela was a double agent, that he was working for Castro. And Ted Shackley, at least, apparently, according to this, thought so too, at the time. Now, as far as I can tell, this is the best CIA document we have of the original meeting with AMLASH, which happened in 1961. Of course, this is before the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is very early, and it portrays AMLASH as repeatedly insisting that the essential first step in overthrowing the regime was the elimination of Castro himself. So their first meeting with AMLASH, he's saying he wants to assassinate Castro. Even though this predates the period I'm talking about, I think this sets the tone for AMLASH. And on October 11th, 1963, just a little more than a month before the assassination, the CIA document says that AMLASH wanted to meet with Robert Kennedy to make sure that he had the support of the Kennedy administration. Then on October 29th, I'll read this document. Desmond Fitzgerald, chief of SAS, he's a CIA guy, met with AMLASH using Nestor Sanchez as interpreter. The cover of the contact plan for the meeting, a copy of which is in the AMLASH file, read as follows. Fitzgerald will represent himself as personal representative of Robert F. Kennedy, who traveled Paris for specific purpose, meeting AMLASH and giving him assurances of full U.S. support if there is change of present government in Cuba. According to Fitzgerald, he discussed the planned meeting with the DDP Helms, Richard Helms, who decided it was not necessary to seek approval from Robert Kennedy for Fitzgerald to speak in his name. So what this means is AMLASH asked to meet with Robert Kennedy. The CIA decided to send Fitzgerald, or Fitzgerald himself probably decided to send himself because he's the boss in this project, as a representative, a personal representative of Robert Kennedy, but without consulting Robert Kennedy. So what's happening here is the CIA is presenting Fitzgerald as speaking for Robert Kennedy. That is, we will support your project, and therefore AMLASH could naturally conclude that the president supports his project, and apparently his project includes assassinating Fidel Castro. So if AMLASH is working for Castro, AMLASH is going to tell Castro the Kennedy administration is trying to assassinate you, and the President of the United States, John Kennedy, supports this attempt to assassinate you. And this is after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the U.S. supposedly isn't doing this anymore. So Castro gets this information, apparently. That is, if AMLASH is a dangle, if he's a double agent, Castro knows that John F. Kennedy is trying to kill him. But it's a lie, because Robert Kennedy was not consulted. The CIA said this is Robert Kennedy's representative, but he wasn't. So the way I see it here, since it is suspected, at least in the CIA, that AMLASH is a double agent, Ted Shackley suspected apparently, and that other guy, whose name I don't remember, suspected it, and he wouldn't take the lie detector test. The way I see this is that the CIA is telling Fidel Castro that John Kennedy, the President of the United States, is trying to assassinate him. And it's not true. So the CIA is lying to Castro, telling him that John Kennedy is trying to assassinate him. And in this document we read that on November 22nd, the day of the assassination, Nestor Sanchez, a CIA case agent, met with AMLASH in Paris and gave him an assassination device, a ballpoint pen rigged as a hypodermic syringe for the injection of poison. According to the Inspector General report of the CIA, it is likely that the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro. Sanchez stated that he received an OPIM cable from Fitzgerald that night or early the next morning telling him that everything was off. But the IG report authors did not find such a cable in the AMLASH file. So apparently that would be an important cable to understand what exactly was off, because the CIA is trying to say this wasn't an assassination plan, but here the Inspector General seems to think it was. Anyway, at the time of the assassination, AMLASH was meeting with the CIA. I think it's important to understand the sequence of events leading up to the assassination. I'll be reading from a church committee report because it's got this all put together for me. In late August 1963, AMLASH was in Brazil and there met with CIA case officers. There is no direct evidence that Castro was aware of these meetings with CIA, but there is reason to believe he was. Shortly after the meeting, CIA received information from another source to the effect that Castro was aware of AMLASH's general sentiments. The case officer could not recall receiving this information, but he knew that AMLASH had been rather openly anti-communist. This is something, there's a document I haven't shown here, but he was mouthing off about being against Castro, really, in ways that the CIA probably would have noticed, and did notice. And so the CIA should be aware that there's a strong possibility that Castro knows exactly what AMLASH knows, and that they're talking to Castro when they talk to AMLASH. So that was August, and in September, Castro gave an impromptu 3-hour interview with AP reporter Daniel Harker and warned against the U.S. aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders. Castro chose a reception at the Brazilian embassy in Havana as the occasion for this tirade. Now, note that AMLASH had been at the Brazilian embassy in where was it? In Brazil, I think, to talk to the CIA. So he's giving that, you wouldn't call it a clue, but he's saying in a covert way to the Americans, I'm talking about AMLASH. I know you're trying to kill me. The connection between Castro's warning and the AMLASH meeting may only be coincidental. See, obviously whoever wrote this report understands that. Nevertheless, AMLASH had proposed a terrorist plan to eliminate Cuban leaders, and according to an informal briefing by a current CIA analyst of Cuban affairs, Castro is prone to resort to subtle nuances, such as the choice of the Brazilian embassy to put his statements in context. So it's as if Castro is saying, I know you're trying to kill me, and if you try to kill me, then I can kill you, too. Similarly, Mr. Roca has concluded there can be no question from the facts surrounding the Castro appearance, which had not been expected, and his agreement to the interview, that this event represented a more than ordinary attempt to get a message on the record in the United States. According to Harker, Castro went on to say, the United States leaders would be in danger if they helped in any way to attempt to do away with leaders of Cuba. We are prepared to fight them and answer in kind. United States leaders should think of that if they are aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders. They themselves will not be safe. So Castro, incorrectly because the CIA was lying to AMLASH, thinks that Kennedy is trying to kill him. And so what Castro does is he tries to kill Kennedy. He sends Oswald. Oswald works for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. That committee is a propaganda arm of Castro's regime. The Castro regime supported it financially, and of course Oswald visited the Cuban consulate in Mexico City. There's plenty of reason to think that Oswald could have been connected with Castro. There's more than that too. And so he thinks Kennedy's trying to kill him, and it's not true, but he sends Oswald to kill Kennedy, and it's the CIA that makes it all happen.